Okay.
Anyway.
With all of that said, let's go ahead and transition to our Best Picture movie series. We are
All
starting in the
right.
40s for the next 10 weeks,
Here we
which
are.
is very exciting. So we're starting off with Rebecca, the Alfred Hitchcock film from 1940, directed by, of course, Alfred Hitchcock, and starring Laurence Olivier, Joan Fontaine, Judith Anderson, George Sanders, among others that come and go throughout the movie. If you are not familiar with Rebecca, it is about a self-conscious woman adjusting to her new role as an aristocrat's wife and avoiding being intimidated by his first wife's spectral presence. All right.
I love the way you make these plot synopses sound even more
sure.
haunted than they probably have any right
Hell
to
yeah.
Got to bring something to it. Absolutely.
be. Yeah.
We'll start with you, Ryan. What did you think about Rebecca?
Yeah, it's a good movie. Good movie.
That's why he was here.
Good
Yeah.
movie.
Good movie. Yeah.
I love this movie. I think it's I'm gonna just spoil this. Maybe this is jumping ahead. Maybe it's jumping the shark. This is one of my 10 favorite Best Picture winners of all time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I love it.
Okay.
I think that this movie is it's one of those movies that you watch and it's if you can, how we talk about movies are very influential. And obviously a lot of what Hitchcock does is very influential, and this is his transition at this time from the British sort of studio system to the American studio system, and this was like the Academy and everybody really embracing him. He had this in Foreign Correspondence in the same year, and they were both nominated for Best Picture, and it was the year of Hitchcock. When
he came of age.
What was so interesting was watching it this time, and we just did a episode over at Awards Watch on the podcast feed. We just did like sexiest movies and horniest movies that are our favorites, and then we talked about challengers, and we just talked about also within love there is repression of love, and there is there's guilt, and there's forbidden temptation and all this, and then there's angst, and that's what like a lot of those sort of ideas simmer around this movie of naivete, of yes, a haunting figure that surrounds it, but then what happens when the idea of love is kind of floated around around the spectrum, and then it turns for some into an obsession, both in terms of the physical and then in terms of the materialistic. Like Mandalay as a place is its
The star
own
of the movie.
is the star of the movie. It's its own creature. You know what I mean? That's like, this is like, that's the real monster. It's not actually Rebecca. It's the totality of what she's built at Mandalay is what's really the obstacle for Joan Fontaine in this film, along with, of course, Laurence Olivier's, Maxim just is essentially, he's still under the thumb of this figure that is foregone, and we see it right from the beginning when he's on the cliff. It's intimidation at its finest, and it's a chess match of who has control. I was reading a lot about obviously movies that are kind of very similar to this, and I was thinking about how this would get cast if we did a modern film, because the Ben Wheatley film doesn't exist. And
I never even saw it. I didn't even see it.
I haven't seen it either. Yeah.
It's terrible. It's so dry. Like that's the thing about that movie. It's so serious and it's so dry. This movie is like darkly funny at times too, just because of the way the reactions are, or the sort of the dialogue and the way it like ping pongs off of characters.
There's an awkwardness to it, especially given how Joan Fontaine is just so
Yeah,
like fish out of water in a lot of ways.
Exactly. And there's that scene of where she's at the lunch table with his friends or whatever, and and Max's friend basically says like, well, what does your wife even really do? You know what I mean? And he says it right to her face. And then of course he faux pas and says like, Well, thank God you're not into sailing, because like that's literally, or boating, because that's like how Rebecca died,
Yeah.
and the whole room just kind of like you could hear a pin drop. But yeah, I mean, this movie's there's so much meat on this bone when you watch it. I mean, we will talk about Mrs. Danvers, who is one of the more fascinating characters ever that Hitchcock has brought to screen. And yeah, I think Hitchcock's uses of shadows throughout this entire film, and the way that the cinematography by
No shadow of a doubt
George
here.
Barnes, it's incredible work. There's If you guys watch it, the map paintings that are in and around and behind them to show the vastness of Mandalay, but it's still, you can feel the constraints, the confines of 1940 cinema.
Yeah.
It's remarkable filmmaking. It's watching Hitchcock is like watching a magic trick every time, but watching this one, it just feels so um urgent, and there's a little bit of dirtiness to it that I kind of really like about it as well.
Yeah.
And so not like dirty and like perverse, but like dirty as in like,
Just kind of unclean.
yeah, it's very, people, for people that are of servants or of a certain manner, they've got a lot of blood and dirt on their hands. They're not afraid to get a little rough there, so
Sure.
it's a great movie. I love it.
I can only imagine even in 1940 when people saw this for the first time, it would have felt like a pretty daring and bold
It's
statement.
kind of scandalous for a 1939 1940 film. It's
It
like
is.
when you're watching it, it's like, geez, they really went for it, huh?
Yeah. And I know I haven't read the source material, but I know its author, Daphne du Maurier, if
Yes,
that's
correct.
how you pronounce her name.
I
She's
could have
sort
helped
of,
you there, but
yeah,
I just
thank you,
wanted you
thank
to
you.
struggle with.
But she's sort of known for that. Like that,
Yeah.
like, her work is known for that as well. I know that she also wrote the source material for the film Don't Look Now, so that's another example of that.
Yep.
And
And the
that is
birds.
The Birds. Yeah, she was the primary story arc for that too. So, and there's always something kind of unclean about her films. Like you're watching something you shouldn't be. It's peeling this like psychological onion back to reveal the worst tendencies of people.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes the film so fascinating. I really like this movie as well. It's I don't think I quite like it as much as you, Ryan, as far as
Yeah.
it being like one of my very favorite Best Picture winners. And if I were to rank Hitchcock's filmography, there are other films I would certainly put above this. In many ways, it most reminds me of Vertigo, and it
Yeah.
kind of does feel like a trial run for Vertigo in some ways, especially in those first two
Those are my
thirds when.
two. Those are my two movies for
Oh, they
Hitchcock.
are. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're
Okay.
yeah. That's those are
Vertigo's
two.
one. Vertigo's
my
Like,
favorite.
yeah.
Psycho's probably my
Vertigo's-
number two,
same.
if I'm being honest.
Psycho's like 3. Yeah.
It's
Those are my
so
top
good,
3.
so good. But there's so much about what Rebecca's doing that remind me a bit of the obsessive qualities of Vertigo, like the costuming of it. When I say costuming, I don't mean like the time period aesthetics or the literal costume design of the film. I mean the fact that we're trying to turn some main character into someone that she is not. And Joan Fontaine here is kind of put into this position of comparison, and she has to try and live up to Rebecca's reputation. And I found that so intriguing watching it again through that lens. And I think Hitchcock does a great job kind of maintaining this ugliness that we're talking about, but also the like the gothic sensibilities that were probably there in the source material as well. It's such a well-made film. There's a ghostliness and a lushness that permeates throughout the entirety of it. And with the matte paintings and all these other things, that just from a filmmaking standpoint, it's kind of astonishing how well it still looks, considering that it's one of Hitchcock's earlier works. For a film from 1940 that is 84 years old at this point now, it really does look quite stunning the way it's all put in place. And he lingers on shots and large scale sets for a while. So it almost has a play like lived in kind of vibe. So I really do like this film. And I think I appreciate it more as a representation of Hitchcock and his journey as a filmmaker. I don't know if I love every choice it makes narratively. We'll get into some of those things, and I'm sure JD may have some of that on his notational docket in front of him. There are a few things I can I might question, at the very least, I'll say,
Okay.
but we'll get to those points. But I think as a filmmaking experience, as a performative experience, especially from Joan Fontaine and Judith Anderson,
Oh my God.
I think it is
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's a very riveting and interesting movie for its time.
Okay. So before people get mad at me, Ryan, I ask for your patience. Just bear with me and hear me out. Even if you vehemently disagree with me, that's fine. I'll start off by saying I do really like the film. I do really
Okay.
like it. The first 2/3 are especially excellent. I know people are split on Joan Fontaine, generally speaking, but how she emulates the constant weight of comparison in Mrs. De Winter is spectacular.
Mhm.
Absolutely incredible. There's a heartbreaking nature to her character that I think carries weight because of her performance, and it's
Yeah.
mostly her non-vocal work that's affecting her eye and facial mannerisms in this film are spellbinding. She does a great job of exhibiting this innocence and inexperience in those early scenes when she's working for Mrs. Van Hopper that is then exploited in the back half of the film, as you guys are talking about, most notably from Mrs. Danvers. And I think Fontaine gives the character a genuine pathos that I find ravishing because the film primarily works as a psychological and romantic character study that examines a young woman constantly drowning, pun intended, in feeling inadequate.
Yeah.
However, what keeps me from loving the film is that it makes this drastic turn in the final third that honestly I find a little baffling. I've never read the novel, so I assume the source material is the major culprit, but its final revelations I do think are convoluted emotionally and frustratingly jarring. The screenplay goes from being this emotionally driven character study to a murder mystery in the blink of an eye, and it's quite weird. It's a complete change in narrative structure and point of
Love
view.
the way you said that. It's quite weird.
It completely changes structure and point of view, and it's just not nearly as compelling to me. As you noted, Brennan, we'll talk about it more as this conversation goes, but I did find myself at a distance, partially because the first 2/3, what came before, is so great, is so exuberant that the turn into being the murder mystery, it's just strange to me. It's still a very good movie on the whole. You'll hear my voice within the choir of praise, even if I'm not singing quite as loudly as everyone else. That's how much I do love those first 2/3. And then there's Hitchcock's filmmaking, as you're talking about there, which is just remarkable, absolutely remarkable. I echo everything you had to say there. So
Yeah.
for me, it really just comes down to the narrative choices. That's the only reservation I have here, but it's strong enough that it keeps this from being certainly one of my top 5 Hitchcock films.
Yeah. Well, you're wrong. But
I knew you were gonna say that.
no, I'm just kidding. No, I and like I get it. I understand it. Though I think within the rules of this society, it makes sense. Like it makes sense in that it's not a grand inquisitory sort of like it doesn't become a full on courtroom. It's still well contained within as much hush hush within everyone as it could be. It's like it's very contained within this small little community, this world, and also it's about these people too. Then about essentially that Mandalay and everything that's gone on there, and what Rebecca's built is she's got the whole town on her side. You know, they talk about these parties, they talk about these events, they talk
Yeah.
about how open her home was, and then
She's Gatsby. She's basically the Great Gatsby.
well, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, she's
Yeah.
Gatsby mixed with Amazing Amy from Gone Girl.
That's
That's
great
what she
comparison.
is. She is this person that has, as Maxim describes her, she has manipulated her way into a marriage of circumstance, and then her real love has then not been her husband, but been the excess that she has created and the image that she has provided those of the world around her. Everyone speaks about her with this reverence, but what she actually is a deeply, and we never see her outside of a painting, and we barely hear, we only know of her name,
Yeah.
and we don't have any flashbacks whatsoever. I think it's a brilliant move by Hitchcock. I think it's a brilliant storytelling decision to never
Yeah.
like just go back and show all that.
Oh yeah.
It's
It's very
allowed though,
spiritual. I
it's
love
a
that.
because it's allowing everyone to interpret this person to how they were, and then later the revelations of who they really are, and
Yeah.
how they then can justify any of those actions with any resemblance of the gray to themselves. And I think that that's a really interesting way of doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by their accounts, by most people's accounts in this film, I mean, it is to assume that she was not the most stable of human beings,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
and by and a very manipulative person in terms of the tools that she would use at her disposal.
Yeah.
And so I think that Maxim's revelation about his wife, still even after she's passed and she is gone and everything, when her boat and body is found, he is terrified because he knows the kind of pain that she can inflict psychologically on his life and everyone around her. And then when even they're done with the trial, which I think is a great touch, when he's by the car before he drives home to Mandalay,
Mm-hmm.
when it was revealed about, not the pregnancy, but essentially using a pregnancy to even entrap him more into
Mm-hmm.
this,
Mm-hmm.
and trapping him into essentially his demise of his life, because he would, she's trying to get him to kill him, to destroy him. I find that to just be really heartbreaking, really fascinating. It's it's one of the most fascinating characters in film history that we never ever see on camera. It's
Yeah.
and I
I
think that
love that
that's such
idea.
an
I
Yeah.
do.
it's such an interesting idea from this being like, I mean, you talked about it, Brendan. This is more of the psychological horror that Hitchcock, that I even gravitate
It's a
more
gothic
towards.
romance. It really
Yeah, it
is.
is. It totally is, because that
Yeah.
place is terrifying. I mean, what what um uh what Danvers does throughout the way she manipulates Joan Fontaine throughout this entire film, the way that she is so close in conversation and breathing upon her down her neck with details.
Yeah.
It's very much the same way, and how it kind of suffocates her. The idea of becoming the new, the new Mrs. De Winter is
Yeah.
then the same face we see Maxim, like when they discover and tell him the news that her body's been found, and how
Mm-hmm.
terrified they both have felt. And that's how, this romance comes to be. I think that the parallels of how Hitchcock is able to use the fish out of water story to then tie it in with this overall horror show that's going on this very prestigious and beautiful, lavish place. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
it's kind of, yeah, it's great. I
It,
love it.
it, it,
Yeah.
it reminds me a lot of stories like The Beguiled, for instance, the Sofia
Yeah.
Coppola film. Or if we want to take it back even further, I know this is based on its own author, but I was also thinking a lot about the works of Nathaniel Hawthorne, something like The Scarlet
Yes.
Letter, for instance, which has not necessarily a gothic sensibility, but more of a witchy sensibility, even if it's not directly about that. Although, if I remember, I think Hawthorne was born in Salem, Massachusetts, so it does kind of make sense if that is the
Yeah.
case. But it does have that tone, and the film maintains that tone, which is why I don't necessarily mind that we are then given this sort of villainous reveal, this sort of murder mystery plotline that you're talking about there, JD, because I think the film tonally was always building to some kind of big thing happening. So I was always ready for it, even when I saw the film for the first time. And I love the idea that it's basically telling us that the person with the best reputation may also have the worst reputation.
She's built the breadcrumbs to those moments.
Yeah,
Because even long after she's gone, she hates him. So she has built that. She's resentful of him as well
yeah.
too.
I, I,
And
I
so she's going to get him one way or another. Like
I
and
yeah.
it's kind of it's so twisted. It's messed
Yeah,
up.
it is. I think the thing I question the most, and maybe this translates a bit to some of your reservations as well, JD. I think it mostly comes down to one scene, which is kind of my maybe biggest reservation, and it is the moment Maxim reveals everything to the new
Oh,
Mrs. De
okay.
Winter. which honestly I feel like just comes at the most convenient and most opportune time. And I'm not
Yeah.
sure if the film did the work to justify how Maxim was ready to reveal all of that information. It honestly just it felt more like a convenience for the audience than it does a convenience for the character. And maybe this is also on Laurence Olivier's performance, which was in many ways kind of a red herring. His performance is kind of a red herring because it's meant to straddle two things. Is he a grief-stricken person, or does he have some other agenda to hide? Like, is he actually complicit in something maybe murderous in some way? Like, there's almost like this untrustworthiness in Maxim in a lot of ways. And I think he sells that portion a lot harder than the other. So it almost kind of felt like a trickery kind of thing to me. And that's what makes that reveal, that transition point, a little awkward for me. I think that's it. So it might not necessarily be the murder mystery third act itself. I think it's the transition from gothic romance to that I don't love, and that's kind of the thing I'm a little torn on there.
Yeah, for me, it's not so much a tone thing. I think Hitchcock does a great job of being consistent there. For me, it does come down to the narrative choices and even more specifically structure. Because from those opening scenes, everything we see is from Joan's perspective. And I'm going to call her Joan because that's easier to say. But it's from her perspective.
She doesn't even have her first name, does she?
She doesn't,
That's what's
which
so
is why I'm
interesting
going to
about
call
the
her
movie.
Joan.
Yeah.
It's all about her loneliness and desires, which again is emphasized most prominently in Fontaine's performance more than what's there on the page. It's vividly clear that Hitchcock wanted that to be expressed with this extreme cogency. She has no family to speak of. She doesn't have any affinity to Mrs. Van Hopper. It makes sense that she would cling on to Maxim's efforts to be with her, even if there's a massive contrast between the two and you're not entirely sure of Maxim's motives. But that's what makes the film so psychologically captivating. We empathize with Joan. We understand why she chooses Maxime. Yet even after being married and moving to Manderley, her loneliness doesn't disappear. If anything, it heightens. It becomes interwoven with this constant comparison and feeling inadequate. She's haunted by the ghost of Rebecca, as everyone else seems to be. And boy, does Fontaine emulate that exquisitely. As a psychological and emotional character study of a young woman marrying into something that might be over her head, it is remarkably enchanting for a lot of the reasons you guys are saying. Honestly, Ryan, as you spoke there after my opening thoughts, I didn't really disagree with anything you said. There are very, very few moments here, if any, where the point of view shifts from Joan in the first 2/3 when it's about her. So why the sudden shift? It makes no sense. I get that Hitchcock wanted to make a faithful adaptation. I just find those revelations to be, one, underwhelming, and two, undermining the progression of Joan, because it takes away from her point of view, which the film had been exclusively from her perspective.
And it turns Maxim into kind of the main character then.
Well, and the ghostly elements you're talking about, I think, are an incredible nuance to that perspective that she feels. So like all of those revelations we get near the end, Maxim kind of spouting all of this exposition to us, and then we get to the courtroom, like I found most of that to be redundant. I feel like we could sense some sort of gravitas, something to that effect, even without us being told explicitly what it is, because it's there in the performances. It's there in Hitchcock's filmmaking. Like I didn't need to be told directly, this is what it is. And the shift to me just, it takes something that I thought was psychologically harrowing and makes it overtly plain and less compelling.
So just to make sure I understand, so you're suggesting that what you were able to get from the film in the first 2/3, the performances, and especially Hitchcock's direction, you were able to get the sense of where this film was going to go narratively, just given those things. Like you knew Rebecca was.
I'll give you two examples.
Because I don't agree, and I'm curious about that.
I'll give you two examples. So there's a scene where Maxime is showing Joan the pictures, the moving pictures from their honeymoon.
Mm-hmm.
And Joan compares herself to Rebecca and mentions that she doesn't want to create gossip, is what she says,
Mm.
implying
Mm-hmm.
that there's lots of gossip around Rebecca. Maxime gets really upset. You see Joan recoil in the moment, immediately regrets her words, again emulating how inadequate she feels. Her
Mm-hmm.
next move goes back and turns his next move, excuse me, Maxime's next move goes back and turns on the moving pictures. And it's just this scene of the two of them cuddling and looking peaceful, which is this
Mm-hmm.
incredible juxtaposition that suggests, again, the inadequacy of Joan, but that there's something stirring in Maxime. There's something dark simmering there, something sinister simmering there that we don't really need to know. It's just his reaction to the
That part I
word
agree
gossip.
with.
Or I
Yeah.
think about the scene when they go for a walk and she innocently, again, emphasizing that word, innocently goes to get the dog, and Maxim freaks out. He makes her feel extremely foolish for doing something affable. And yes, that is there on the page. I will give credit to the screenplay. There's enough there on the page in terms of manifesting that psychological nuance and that volatility for sure. But it's
Mm-hmm.
especially there in the performances that, without the film telling us directly, and to your point, Ryan, through other characters, we come to understand that Rebecca had a reputation, that she was revered at this place. But because of Maxine, it does seem to suggest that, okay, there's something there that's also not great. Like, before he even reveals to us what had happened, I feel like I already knew that
Oh
duality
yeah.
in Rebecca.
Oh
And
yeah.
Oh,
so,
see,
like,
that's interesting.
I didn't need
Well, I didn't know.
for
Yeah.
that
I
because it's
got
there in those other scenes.
I always got the sense that when I saw the movie for the first time, which was I think sometime maybe like in 2016, maybe
Okay.
2017, my first thought was, "Oh, Maxim is just a murderer." Like that was
Yeah.
my whole thought the whole time. That's what made the reveal
Yeah.
more surprising to me. Like I don't know if the first 2/3 make it very clear that Rebecca is the one sort of puppeteering these things, or was always the one, and that Maxim is really just a grief-stricken victim in all of this. I
Mm.
always got the sense, at least my first time seeing it, was that the movie's trying to point to him as some type of culprit in this. So like I never caught on to those pieces specifically. So the reveal itself was always surprising to me. I just don't know if I like the way it was revealed. Like it just like the convenience of that data dump of information in that shed was a little too timely for me, if that makes sense.
I think that. So a couple of things. Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. Is I when I see it, I see it a little bit differently now, Brendan, because I've seen the movie so many times.
Sure.
I see every time I see Max when we first meet him, because he is very. I mean, JD, to your point, he's like that even at the first shot of the film on the cliff, right? And there's
Yeah.
this unedginess within their first interaction. I think of it as yes, a grief-stricken person, but also someone that wants to forget, is trying so desperately to forget how he got here to the first place. I mean, he keeps saying it. I should have never gone back to Mandalay. We never should have come here, because even trying to move on, I can't. Not because of how she died or the circumstances, or just the fact of, if it was just a regular normal circumstance of grief, you would want to move on and not be reminded of the person that died in your life.
Yeah.
Add then the juxtaposition of the psychological warfare that this woman played on him, both not just within his own home, but within his own community and with his name. Like, you don't want anything to do with her. And I know why he gravitates towards, his new wife, the new Mrs. De Winter, Joan Fontaine, is because she's the complete antithesis to a person like Rebecca, and that she is innocent, and he is drawn to that. It likes that she is, like, all of his friends, all of their community, every one of their workers thinks that she's simple, but he prefers that because that means she's innocent. That means that they have a chance and maybe happiness that he never got to have before. And I
Mhm.
think the reveal, Brendan, while as timely maybe within the moment of like literally after, you know, this, you know, everyone's searching and everything, things could get discovered, and it's the only opportunity left before that they might be alone. And so I think that that's where
Yeah.
it all crumbles,
Mhm.
because at that point it's like, I have kept up everything. He's not even himself anymore. He's back to like, because he's just like, oh yeah, yeah, your costume, I got mad at it, yeah, yeah, it doesn't matter. I totally forgot about it, because it's
Mhm.
furthest thing from his mind now, because he's now having to then, what he thought was a thing that's far gone from him. What he says there is perfect, where he says, well, we had our shot, didn't we? You know, like we essentially, we had our chance to be happy, and she wouldn't allow it to happen. The main character of this movie isn't Joan Fontaine. It isn't Laurence Olivier. Main character of this movie is the titular character that we never see here. And that's why I think the first half of the film, then moving it over to the second half of the film, I think that this is how I always interpret it. Maybe you guys
Mhm.
think of it differently.
Sure.
And maybe it's a cop out, and I don't care, because I think it's great. The reason why is, we're just positioned on what Rebecca has done at Mandalay and how that affects Joan Fontaine. And in the second half of the film, we are just posed on what Rebecca has done to Maxime, and how he has to suffer the consequences for this, and how he has to sort of pay and have to survive at all the work that she has kind of done, both not intentionally against who is going to be the next person there, just at the reputation that she has created. And then, yes, to Maxim, it's definitely more pointed in the second act of this film, in the second half of
Mhm.
this film. It's
Mhm.
much more because of what had gotten to those events that allowed her to be on those boat and that body to be found. But I don't think, no, I don't think that the whole film is like her literally like it's tied that neat in a bow of her like, I knew he would marry this woman, and I knew she would, like, I'd screw up her life, and I knew I told Mrs. Danvers to do that. No, it's
Yeah.
what she's psychologically done to someone like Danvers, to someone like the staff, to their friends, the impression that they've left, that then builds this heap of gossip and doubt. Like the idea of gossip, right, has
Mhm.
bled through this town now. And when the coroner goes to Maxim, he's like, I'm so sorry that you have to live through all this
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you have to go through this, and hopefully it's not that bad, but it's going to be when salacious things happen. And then, of course, the idea of obsession, which is a big component of this movie. The idea of
That's a
obsession
Hitchcock staple right there.
being within Mrs. Danvers and being the downfall again, and almost continuing the traumatic pain that Rebecca was causing now on to not only Joan Fontaine, but then potentially Laurence Olivier through her testimony, which is a fantastic scene.
Mhm.
And how she really does technically try to hold as much power as she can before realizing she didn't have any at all, before realizing her perception of Rebecca is also a broken perception as well too, and then leading to her ultimate demise in the end.
Yeah.
I think it's just a brilliant way of doing a story like this, that, like, I mean, we see this done so many times, these gothic movies. I was seeing this, I always watch this interview of like this director roundtable from the 2017 directors and the best director nominees, and Del Toro talks about how PTA was very inspired by this film to make Phantom Thread, and
Sure.
of course Crimson Peak was very inspired by this movie too. And as I was watching it, you know, my wife Megan, she looked at me and she went like, I can understand what Del Toro was going for, but he just didn't nail it, did he? You know what I mean? It's like it's just there's something
No, no,
inherently
no down talk on Crimson Peak. That movie
there's
rocks.
I love it
she just
too.
said there's just something inherently sinister behind every turn, every edit. This movie's immaculately edited. When you really look
It's
at
a
it
very
through
well made movie. Yeah.
through just the
Yeah.
technical aspect of it, it has to be that precise. And it has to be that way also too, because of who Rebecca was as a person as well too, a little bit. So
I
I think that I think yeah, it's but I understand all your kind of like your frustrations,
Mhm.
or your just maybe disappointments and how certain aspects are. But I think over time, like for me, I've just understood them reading the source material and seeing this, and then also seeing the atrocity that is the remake from 2020. Like
Yeah.
the
Again,
choice,
haven't
this
seen
movie
it.
moves. This movie moves at such a pace that even in those moments that like are lesser, I forgive a lot of it because it's just so damn entertaining as well too of a
Well,
film.
if I
As well.
can speak to that real
Yeah.
quickly, because I think maybe, and I did mention this in my opening thought, so I guess to reiterate that the disparity here might simply come down to the art of adaptation.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I
that's fine.
think the ghostly presence of Rebecca and how that trickles into all of these things probably works extremely well in the novel because you
Mhm.
have all that time to explore the effects of Rebecca on all of these various things. But that's not what this film does. The first 2/3 of this film is from Joan's point of view. We never ever leave her point of view. And so all we see is the ghostly presence of Rebecca, which again is vividly haunting. I agree with you there, Ryan. Like the
Mhm.
effects of Rebecca on Manderley and especially on Joan, how that manifests through this inadequacy that she feels, this constant weight of comparison, and how that is formed in the performance, I think is extremely great. Like as a psychological character study, I think the film is working on all cylinders. The
Okay.
first 2/3 of the film, I think, are perfect,
There's
especially
actually,
when you
yeah.
include Hitchcock's filmmaking and the technical precision of the film. I totally agree. But I think
Yeah.
as a film, obviously a different medium, it's really challenging
Mm,
to have your cake and eat it too. And I think that's where the
mm,
final third of this film does struggle for me because Hitchcock wants to tell a faithful adaptation, which includes having those revelations and showing us how Rebecca infiltrates into all of these things. But the bulk of the film had not been about them. It had been about Joan and how she is affected by it all. So to me, it's that's why I said the shift is weird because it is a very, very strange turn to being a murder mystery all of a sudden when it had been explicitly, vividly, explicitly this character study for the majority of the film, which I think is excellent again. And
mm.
to speak to
Yeah.
something you said earlier too about Maxim here, and I very much do agree. I think maybe Laurence Olivier and his performance is perhaps what I really love about the character because I do agree
Mm.
there is this dolefulness in the character. And maybe that's why I didn't feel what you did, Brendan, because I did sense a man that is certainly regretful,
Mm.
perhaps in some sort of mourning, but then we also get that moment where he talks about how he hates her. But even before you get to that moment, you knew that something sinister was bubbling because of these outbursts he has toward Joan. But then he would always come back. He would recoil in the moment, but then understand what he had done, and he shows Joan this empathy. So there's this volatility in the character that suggests that something terrible had happened, and I that to me makes a big difference. So when he
Yeah.
gives us the revelations of what happened, I honestly didn't mind that as much because again, even in that moment, it's still like Joan is still the point of view. And she's hearing this information for the first time, which is why we're hearing this information for the first time. It's mostly after that where it becomes a courtroom drama and this murder mystery thriller and who
Yeah.
died and who murdered, and like that to me is where it's all of a sudden structurally a very different movie. It is not at
Yeah.
all tethered to what came before. Tonally, yes, Hitchcock
Yeah.
tonally makes
Yeah.
it work,
He
but
sets it up
structurally and
yeah.
narratively it's not. It's very different, and that does take me out of the movie, especially because Joan's perspective is what had drawn me to it, and how she reacts to the ghostly sinisterness of it all. And then I could also
Oh,
talk about Mrs. Danvers and how she plays a part of that. She's the one that revered Rebecca, so that's also
she
a clue.
that there's the other obsessive quality there that was so fascinating. There's a moment where if you end this movie, it's actually a very fascinating movie in and of itself. If you end this movie on the line with Joan saying, I'm Mrs. De Winter now. Like if you just end it there, that's
I
a very
would've-
fascinating.
Yes, love it. Curtains raised, A+.
Well, and watching her, take more ownership as I'm now the wife of this household. It's my job to do this. It's something weirdly cathartic about that because of how compelling Joan Fontaine is. Pardon me, that I do find that interesting. The more I think about this, and I keep trying to trace my steps back to when I first saw the movie and why I still really liked it at the time, and I still really like it now too. But maybe where I was having some similar reservations, but maybe in a different way, it might sound kind of like blasphemy, but I think my biggest problem with the movie is Laurence Olivier's performance.
Really?
Because like the more I think about it, I'm trying to think back to my first time seeing it and how I was perceiving things. If I go back to the scene in the boathouse between Maxim and Joan, and when that revelation comes that we're talking about here, even as he's spilling the beans about who Rebecca was and what this was, my first thought was, I don't believe you for a second. I still don't trust you. And I felt that throughout much of it, which made those final moments in the courtroom and how it was starting to basically confirm all of his notions. I thought, that's kind of underwhelming to me now, because I felt like your performance was suggesting still, even to this point, untrustworthiness.
And I think that is the case. Honestly, I think that is the
then
case.
I think that's a problem with the movie. Then,
And maybe it is. Like,
yeah.
I do like the duality that I mentioned earlier, like this volatility, like these outbursts he has toward Joan, but you do sense the dolefulness in the character. To speak to what you're saying, though, I do think it is kind of funny. We're talking about a film from 1940, and we've already revealed spoilers, so I guess any more spoiler alerts. But
no warning here.
So he's like 85. This movie's like 85.
But it's just really
84
funny
years
to me,
old. Yeah.
because this film changes the death of Rebecca from being a murder in the novel to it being an accidental death because of the Hays Code. That's why they had to make that change, was because of the Hays Code. However, he still, despite the change, he still covers up the death and he scuttles the boat. There's he admits that himself. And there's still a shadiness to that. Like, that's still very dubious behavior.
And maybe the film kind of lets him off the hook a little too
I think
easily.
so. Like, I think
like, shouldn't that be kind of
does.
the point of the movie? Maybe it is. Maybe I'm not sensing like some like
Yes.
conversation we're supposed to have about that in that way.
And again, this is my problem in terms of the narrative structure, because
Okay.
I do think this is where the film does lose out on that momentum, because it's not about any of these things. But the court deciding that it was a suicide, that does not negate his choices to cover up the murder and scuttle the boat, which the film doesn't really wrestle with. But those things are still true about the character.
That's an interesting idea to sort of tie him back to these sort of contradictory, hypocritical, and cynical sort of behaviors of high society that Rebecca herself embodied. And if he was a victim in all this, is he kind of doing the same thing now?
Yeah.
That's an interesting idea. And I feel like we're talking about it here, so maybe the film is doing its job in stimulating that conversation, but at the same time, I feel like we're also trying to reach for that. Like, I'm not sure if the film is like really inviting that conversation, or if it really is on its mind at all.
I don't think it explores that very well. And maybe it does in the novel, because to your point, Ryan, not only do we see the effects of Rebecca on Joan, even though that's most of the movie, we do see it on these other characters, including Maxim. And I think part of that dubiousness there that we're talking about here, even though the film doesn't examine it all that well, I do think part of why he scuttles the boat and covers up the death is because he knows that the ghost of Rebecca is going to haunt him. Yeah. And it does haunt him. That's why he makes those choices.
Maybe
just
it's
wish
his own
the
fault.
film, and again, like I understand that's probably there in the novel, and it's probably more thorough in the novel. But this film is not really about Maxim. Like, he's gone through a half of this movie because he's out doing business stuff. Like, the perspective of this film is from Joan, and leaving that perspective to become a murder mystery, I don't know. It doesn't really work for me.
This is an interesting movie.
It's interesting. Like, I want to agree with you, Ryan, because those ideas on paper are inviting. They're fascinating. I just don't think in execution, it just isn't there for me. Again, the turn is weird, but everything with
That's
Joan,
fair.
I think, is excellent.
Yeah. No, I think also to me, I think with Maxim, who, I mean, like, anytime Laurence Olivier just wants to like drive me around in a car and like sweep me off my feet, go right on ahead.
Oh, so
Like,
not Morgan Freeman. You'd rather it be Laurence Olivier.
no, because she at least sits in the front seat with him. Morgan Freeman would make me sit
Fair
in the
enough.
back, and I'm not about
Fair
that.
enough.
Yeah.
I'm not a backseat driver.
I'm going to join Cliff
Uh,
Booth. That's who I'm joining.
there you go. I do think that the one thing that it could have done, and I think that this is what you guys are kind of alluding to, which is how his traumatic pain, how he's inflicting this on Joan Fontaine, right?
Mhm.
And how
Yeah.
essentially I would have loved to see a little bit more of that. I do think that they try to subtly hint at that because I think that I think he does feel a little bit of every time he blows up, and then he kind of realizes that he's blowing up because of Rebecca. He's not blowing up because of really anything she's doing. He's
Yes,
doing it because of his
it's
wife.
the haunting nature for sure.
Yes, and
Yes.
he realized, and every time he's very regretful. I think he is there's a little bit of understanding there of I've brought you into this and I shouldn't have, and this is
He tells her
this is
twice that it
he
was
tells
selfish
her,
of him to do so.
yeah, it was very
Yeah.
selfish, and I do love that about it as well because it is interesting about someone being drawn or being forced in a trap and then having the only way to crawl out is having someone drag down there with them. And I think that that's a trope that is kind of built from this movie that is used throughout the gothic romance or the psychological thriller that we see in modern contexts in movies of that nature, of this nature. And I do think that by the end, when everyone is searching for the body, and he should be out there, right, searching for the body of his dead wife or what's coming on shore of his house. He's very well aware of that, and he's aware. And I think that that's when the revelations, it's at a certain point, it's just going to all flow out. He can't hold it in within anymore. He can't contain it. And he says it. And I think that's where there could have been maybe, it always comes in threes, certain things of like this nature. And also we're getting on a movie that's made in 1940. So I always give that a little bit of a caveat as well. But I think that there could have been more to relay the point of how regretful he was in essentially doing what Rebecca did to him in a lot of ways, because we see her pain. Like, we see her literal pain of what Danvers is creating upon her. It's consuming her. It's anxiety. It's perfectionism. It is chasing a goal or a ghost that she will never be able to chase. It's unobtainable. And it's fascinating to watch. And it's fascinating to just see. I mean, honestly, the performance of this movie is Judith Anderson, if we're really going to talk about performances, because what she does as Mrs.
really
Danvers,
she's really good. Fascinating.
She's just habitually a line stepper. She is stepping on that line over and over and over and pushing the buttons of this young girl, even more than Maximus. And he knows what Danvers is, can be creative, because that's what he's with his wife. And I wish that there was a little bit more actually between Maxim and Danvers, rather than them being so separated until the end of that. So I do agree with you a little bit on that, JD. Those are almost like my little things that I always like wish that there were just like a little bit of, a little bit of more extra stuff. Like, I think that this movie has 10 or 20 more minutes in it. I think it could even be greater than it already is in my estimation. Just to kind of build these characters, because clearly there should be, if he's so haunted by his wife, well, his wife's co-conspirator is this woman, what I mean, who is the one that's making orders, like literally right when they're walking in from their honeymoon, it turns to, from that moment in, when the whole staff's there, this should be a chess match between the three of them. And and it really becomes just a chess match between the two women.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. And I think you make a great point there, that Ryan, that maybe we could have benefited from a little bit more of that regretful side of Maxim.
Yeah.
And maybe that could have also further justified his genuine interests in Joan, because even and again, tracing it back further to when I saw the film for the first time, even when we get to the literal final minutes of the film before we arrive back to Mandalay and it's burning down, I still half expected him to reveal himself as Norman Bates or something like that. Like I was like, I still got that vibe from him. Like I really did.
That's
and
crazy how differently we saw that character.
I guess
No, I think you're
never bought it.
Brendan, I think you're kind of right. Like you just feel like he's kind of repented so much that there's
It's
so
still
much
kinda
like
skeezy to me.
yeah,
Like,
there's something still bubbling that he has to get out.
Mhm.
And
There is something dubious.
know,
I do
Yeah.
agree there, but I also feel like his empathy and his affection for Joan is genuine. Like I don't feel like that's coming from some
And
sort
Yeah.
of
let
manufacturer.
me say this. I don't think it's disingenuous, but I also still got the sense that this man is hiding something that he did torturously wrong. It was
Yeah.
like they were still treating his performance like a red herring that was still waiting to reveal something later.
Which I think it does still a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, if the movie really
For the
addresses
reasons
it,
we
I don't
talked
know.
about. Like
yeah,
I still think that is there, even if the Hayes Code seems to think that it's doing something differently, and that's a whole nother conversation. But I
You
do
know,
think
it
that
does
red
add a little
herring
bit
here,
of nuance to the nature of Rebecca's death and how involved he may or may not have been. Like I will say, if
Yeah.
that was changed due to the Hayes Code, it does add a tricky nature to the actual truth of it all, which might benefit the movie in some ways.
well, I think it speaks to, and obviously we know this, but
Mhm.
it speaks to how silly and dumb the Hayes Code is because
Yeah.
it thinks that
be
by
careful.
changing it to it being accidental, then all of a sudden he's left off the hook, even though what he does is still very gray and dubious.
Hey,
Times
like,
were different back then, weren't they?
yeah. Well, I mean, depending on some people on Twitter, they'd like to go back to that way because there's not enough sex in fucking movies, and there's not enough, but there is a lot, and there's not enough here, but there's so much here. It's like, make up your minds, guys. Everybody seems so weird about. You know what I'm talking about? Like there was so much of the discourse with poor things last year, and there's so much discourse with challengers, and there's some this and that,
Yeah.
and you know
Mhm.
what can be in a movie, what can't be in a movie. It's like people are so hung up on this, and it's like people forget because people aren't educated enough to go back. I'm sorry, I know that this sounds rude to say that, but these are just the truth. People aren't educated enough to go back into the history of a medium that they only cover since like movies from the 1980s and examine the fact that there were laws put in that literally restricted the artists from being able to do certain things within a film, like you're talking about, JD, which is the Hays Codes. I mean, we talked about this on an old extra film series when we did Howard Hawks about how some people sort of, and Billy Wilder, the subversion of the Hays Code and being able to use that to your advantage. And I don't think that Hitchcock is there just yet within the system enough because Lord knows later in his career he starts fighting against the Hollywood machine and creating movies like Psycho and The Birds and Vertigo and the classics that we know. But I think that maybe that is the tug and pull of being a more newish director to the Hollywood machine and making a movie like this. And I
the
think
Hays
that
Code was somewhat new at the time, right? When was that
it was
established? Like mid-30s?
mid-30s, yeah.
Okay.
And it's rampant throughout this decade. But then you also that's what's so great about it, because then all the screwball comedies are literally, they're just tapping the line and how far they can go with things. And it's that's what makes them so great, and that's what makes them iconic.
Flirting with danger. I gotta love
like watch a movie like Only Angels Have Wings from Howard Hawks. And that movie is like, man, that is a middle finger to the Hays Code, if there ever was one, and yet the studios were okay with releasing it. So, but if you really look at the context of that movie, it's like, wow, he was pushing it. So, but I do think that maybe there are some compromises, yes, that Hitchcock did make different than the source material. But overall, I think I love the book. I think it's a really great adaptation. I think it's a really great movie, and I listen. I hate that remake. Okay, on paper, it's actually not a bad idea.
So I guess it doesn't exist. I guess
it shouldn't exist. It's like somewhere in the Netflix algorithm. Like it's because it was like a Netflix movie. Kristen Scott Thomas playing Mrs. Danvers, not a bad choice. Lily James playing the Joan Fontaine character, maybe not bad, but I mean, like Armie Hammer playing Laurence Olivier playing Maxim. Like, what are we doing here? Like, Mr. Choppy himself, Mr. Cannibal. Like, like, come on, what are we doing here?
I had no. Forgive me if I didn't notice you saying this earlier in this conversation, Ryan. But I didn't know you actually read the book that this was based on.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do know how to read. And
that's not what I was saying. I was actually genuinely curious. Like, so this is a very faithful adaptation in the sense of what we see on screen in Hitchcock's film is pretty in line with what we get.
It's pretty close. Like, like what's actually what he does do, what he sort of adds is the final bit of the film. Like Danvers does melt the house down essentially, but we don't. But in the book, it's kind of more like the house is on fire, and so you kind of assume that it's Mrs. Danvers. This is like literally he lays it out like this is her, and I think that's. I think that final shot of her in the fire.
It's an unforgettable image. It's
really
an
fantastic. Unforgettable, just like full on obsessed, crazed, heartbroken. I would think also even a little bit too, if you want to throw that in there. Of the various emotions
like Hitchcock is known for making thrillers, obviously. I never really saw him as a quote unquote horror director in like the gothic sense of this time period, especially. I would say maybe like The Birds and Vertigo are probably the closest. I guess Psycho is definitely a horror film. But movies like Rear Window, I would say, are more in the thriller kind of side of things. But that final image is one of the most frightening things I think I've seen in a Hitchcock film.
It's great. I agree.
Yeah, it really is well done.
I gotta tell you, there's one moment in the scene that always, like, I feel like the air gets sucked out of the room for me, and I've seen this movie, probably a dozen times, and I gotta tell you, it's when Joan Fontaine's on the bed right after, and it's during the party, right?
Yeah.
And she's Danvers has screwed her over because she's dressed as Rebecca, right?
Yeah.
And Danvers having that brief pause, going to the window, opening it, and says, "You should leave here. You should go. Like you should leave
like
Mandalay."
Encourages her to jump off.
Exactly. And I sit there and every time and I go, "Oh my God, she's gonna push her off." Like
how
she's
did
gonna
that get
straight
through
up
the Hays Code?
That's what I'm saying. Like I'm like, that is like suggestive
nasty.
suicide.
That is
nasty
it is.
Stuff. It is a thorny scene. And it's so vicious.
It is, and
that's what I just kind of love about it, because it's wild to put this in a movie like this in 1940.
I agree. And to, I guess, put a wrap on the bow, at least from my perspective, with this debate between Brendan and I as it relates to Laurence Olivier here, to me, that is such a significant clue for me. In addition to Olivier's performance, I've talked about how I understand the volatility there. I do agree, Brendan, there's something bubbling underneath. There's a dubiousness there. I don't know if I could go as far as to feel the way you do about him, but I do agree there is something gray there. There's a volatility. There are the outbursts, but I also sense something melancholic in the character. There's something soulful and doleful there, and he still treats Joan with compassion, and I do think that is genuine. So I do think Laurence Olivier is very good at tapping into that duality, and you couple that with Mrs. Danvers, who has no subtlety in this film, and I say that as a great thing. That is an amazing thing about this film. Like, immediately she's antagonistic toward Joan, and given what we know about her and her relationship with Rebecca and how that complements some of the perhaps dubious behavior of Rebecca that we come to find out, to me, those clues are suggestive that Rebecca is perhaps more of a culprit here than Maxim is. That was at least my interpretation of it.
Gotcha.
So when we do get those reveals at the end, because Mrs. Danvers is, for all intents and purposes here, is the villain of this movie and is very clearly the antagonist to Joan. And because the perspective is from Joan, we get so much of that. Ryan, you talked eloquently earlier about how it's the chess game between the two of them primarily in this film
For the soul of that house.
for the soul of that house.
Yeah.
And Rebecca
Yeah.
Really?
being such a ghostly presence there, assuming or at least implied that Mrs. Danvers is carrying out the ethos of Rebecca, that to me, the reveals did not surprise me at all. Of course it was Rebecca the whole time. Like to me, it was more redundant than anything else. Now I will say again, more so than the revelations that we get from Maxim, it's more so how the film structurally changes after that I have more of a problem with, as I talked
that
about
hump
earlier.
that it goes through. Yeah.
But to me, Mrs. Danvers is such a great character. I love the foreboding presence of her. And given what she represents as it relates to Rebecca, that's why I felt so inclined to feel as if Rebecca was the one orchestrating everything here, because she was. It turns out.
That Danvers, she kind of reminds me of a less bubbly version of Midge from Vertigo. And in many ways, maybe what Midge does in that movie is a bit more. It's not as deliberate of a move against Scotty. You know, it's certainly a different thing there. But again, like I watched this movie in the context of film of Hitchcock's filmography, and it is kind of fascinating how much of the 2/3 here in Rebecca are very tonally in line with something like Vertigo 18 years later. Like, it does feel does feel very like trial run like for him. And that's not to undermine the film as something significantly lesser than Vertigo, even though I think Vertigo is his best movie. It's interesting how he would do both of these so close, not really so close together, but it's just interesting to see it this time beforehand, before he really became the household Hitchcockian name that we associate him with.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you guys have any final thoughts? I know we're kind of running long here, so I guess we can wind down. Any final thoughts?
From an awards perspective, I'd just like to say this real quick, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yes.
I've actually covered this year on an episode of Kevin Jacobson's podcast. And the runner-up is.
Great show.
I realized this about 5 minutes before we were recording that I had. So I've seen all the films, the 10 films nominated for Best Picture. There are some really bad movies in there.
Okay.
I'm looking at you, The Long Voyage Home in Our Town, and all this in Heaven too. I'm looking at you. But there's some great films that went up against Rebecca for Best Picture. The Philadelphia Story, which is
I just watched that a few months ago.
An absolutely essential film of the era. Of
I
the
like
40s.
it. I'm not in love with it, but I like it.
I love that film.
Yeah, I love it too.
The Great Dictator, Charlie Chaplin's
of course.
masterpiece.
Love me some Chaplin.
Love that it got embraced enough here by the Academy for him to get Best Picture and Best Actor nominated too.
But it worked, I guess.
And but if everyone hasn't seen it, The Grapes of Wrath really is that movie. I know that we all probably saw it when we were in high school and watched it there.
And we had to read the book and do.
And we had to read the book, and they beat it to death. But then, like during the pandemic, when I did the episode and I watched The Grapes of Wrath, gotta tell you, that movie kind of slaps, and it's really beautiful, and it's just poetic. And John Ford,
that's a good movie.
It's a good damn movie.
Yeah, that's a really good movie.
Fonda's great. Jane Darwell won best supporting actress for playing Ma Jode. I don't think she's as good as Judith Anderson in this movie, but she's damn good in that movie. She has that monologue at the end. I would still give it to Rebecca, but it also was a director split. It went to John Ford for Grapes of Wrath. I probably give it to Hitchcock, just because Hitchcock's never won a Best Director Oscar. He's never won he never won an Oscar, period. This is the only awards thing that's ever happened to him in his career, which is why the Oscars are why the Oscars are stupid. But they weren't last year. You know what I mean? It's like it's like damn if you do, damn if you don't.
Exactly.
They're learning from their mistakes.
I tell JD knows this. I get so mad with them, and then they do something like last year where my favorite film wins. The director that I want, that I've always loved, like Nolan, that we've all loved, like Nolan, gets his flowers. Killian wins. There's all these great wins, and I'm like,
it's the Godfather 3 every other year.
It's every time I'm out, they pull me back in.
They'll reverse course next year when another Green Book wins.
Oh God,
That's what I mean. Every other year, like you're like, I'm done with the Oscars now till the
No, I think
comes.
it's going to revert to something really small, like not like I'm saying like the quality
like
of
a
this movie,
Nomad
but
Land.
like a Moonlight, yeah, like like something really small, because like there doesn't
Yeah.
seem to be like a lot of big movies, and that was such a big movie last year. And like they usually then, like JD says, then they go teeny tiny on something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, good movie. Really like it. Everyone should get the Criterion, because it's an excellent Criterion restoration.
It is. I would agree with that.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful cover too. Yeah.
It is very modern feeling as well, but I think matches the just the overall aesthetic of the film. The film does really look ahead of its time, and that's something I really do appreciate about it. The music here by Franz Waxman, is really it's almost Bernard Herrmann-esque.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it's like it's moving. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but like to say that this is also a trial run for Vertigo, that also comes through in the musicality of the film.
Yeah.
When I saw it for the first time, I thought it was a Bernard Herrmann score. It has some of those similar inflections, and I really like the music here. And Franz Waxman I guess he did the score for some of Hitchcock's earlier films as well, but also The Bride of Frankenstein of all things. So definitely one of the earlier names that I think someone we should remember. But yeah, the music here is really good.
JD, can I say one thing that last, and then I'll let you do a final thought. And I'm not trying to cut your thunder, but I know how big a fan you are of this movie. It's like your favorite movie of all time.
Of course.
Is that the ending of this movie? They're 1 year separated, because in 41 is when Citizen Kane comes out. When you watch this movie, and the way that the pillow kind of engulfs in the flames, right? The embroidery of the R there.
The framing is pretty similar.
It's it felt very similar to the shed at the end of Citizen Kane. I was thinking about that a lot. And by the way, JD, and this is for everybody out there, JD, I watched Citizen Kane last year again, and I can't get it out of my head. It's an incredible film. Like, I think about it all the goddamn time. I'm in love with it all over again. And but no, I was thinking about that. Literally, there are certain shots, and I was like, I think that that Wells watched a lot of early Hitchcock to really invoke a lot of his sensitivities as a director.
I'm curious, even though the release dates are a year apart, what the production process was for both, because it does seem as if Wells and Hitchcock are working on a similar wavelength, technically speaking. And while I love what Hitchcock does with Rebecca, I do think that in terms of technical prowess, they're pretty much on par. Really, the only difference is I think Wells takes that technical precision and just does it tenfold more than what we see with Rebecca. But in terms of the technical precision of both films, the editing, the cinematography of Rebecca is breathtaking. It really is fantastic.
It's amazing.
The set design, of course, the production of it is all fantastic. And something you said earlier, Brendan, that I don't think should be overlooked is the costuming of this film, because it really is a thematic component to the film when you consider how they tried to turn Joan into something she's not. There is psychological warfare there, and it manifests itself a couple of different times in this film. And so that is also very important. So all of the technical components are working in spades. And I think that's why my frustrations of this film are so high, because there is a true masterpiece here, which a lot of people do claim that, Ryan being one of them.
Yeah.
But it's why I can't go there, because the final 15, 20 minutes of this film, I think, take this detour that is wholly unnecessary. Some of the reveals are redundant, but primarily it takes away from a perspective that I found so engulfing and so captivating and poignant that to remove that point of view, it just completely unravels the movie for maybe not completely, but certainly takes the wind out of the sails for me. And so I can't quite go that far, but everything preceding that I do think is quite immaculate. It's fantastic, including Laurence Olivier. We talked about him earlier. Judith Anderson is striking in this film. Also, shout out to George Sanders, who I think is
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
quite fun and invigorating in his small little
I
performance
agree.
here.
I agree.
And I also want to emphasize another time Joan Fontaine. It seems like her reputation, especially in recent years, is a little mixed. Some are mild on her. She has this, at least in film Twitter circles, it's been a little polarized. But I think she is the beating heart of this film in many ways because again, the perspective is from Joan throughout most of this movie, and
Yeah.
there's this innocence to her that is exploited that I think comes through extremely well in her performance. That moment when she shows off her costume and you get the reaction there from the people in the room, it is utterly heartbreaking. It is devastating. She was so excited to surprise everyone in that room, especially Maxim. She was desperate to show them this costume that she had made. She didn't want anyone to see it. She wanted to see their surprise and the smile on their faces. That's what she's anticipating.
Right.
And then of course it's anything but that, and it's just heartbreaking. And I think Fontaine's performance sets that up impeccably.
Yeah.
Just the way that innocence is exploited here, I think it really is because of her performance. That's the reason it works more than anything else.
Yeah.
So like I do really love her performance here quite a lot. So
It's really good. It's really good.
you know, all of that to say, I still really like the film. Still really like it. Good movie.
Hate mail to JD Durant.
Well, I guess in the
I'll
spirit
read it
of
for
that,
you, JD.
yes, if you agree or disagree with me, you can leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube, or reach out to us on social media, or email me insessionfilm@gmail.com. That's fine. You can send your hate mail toward me. We can discuss.
Leave him alone.
15 minutes.
Leave him
of this
alone.
further.
I'll
It's
take it.
fine.
I'll take it.
The world would be a dull place if we all agreed on everything.
Yes.
What do we always say around here? You know,
Exactly.
So,
And
yeah. It's not like he's giving it 1 star. It's not like it's Madam Web.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Even if he did, who cared?
Yeah, who cares? It's just a movie.
It's really just the last 15 minutes that we'll debate. That's about it.
It's okay.
Oh, geez. Thank God this movie wasn't directed by Zack Snyder.
Oh God. Yeah. Wait, did you guys do the Scavenger or whatever that movie?
Yeah.
Did you guys review that one?
We discussed Rebel Moon. It released last week. Thanks for doing the plug there, Ryan. You can check out that podcast review.
I'll never watch
check out the review. Don't check out the movie.
I'll watch the review. I'm never gonna watch that movie. You couldn't pay me.
That's fine. No. You don't need to. Spoiler alert, you don't need to watch it.
Spoiler alert, I'm not gonna.
Spoiler alert, even further, you're smarter than both of us.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah. As Ryan teased a second ago, on next week's show, we are reviewing not Citizen Kane, but instead How Green Was My Valley, which won Best Picture that year.
I might not be here for that, but I'm just gonna say it's not a bad movie. But it's not Citizen Kane. There you go.
It's not Citizen Kane.
Man, I've never seen it yet, but I'm secretly hoping that.
You never seen it?
I've not seen it.
Oh, okay.
So I'm gonna come back and see.
Great.
I'm gonna come back and see it for the first time and say that was better than Citizen Kane.
We'll see.
And if that happens, I will be out of a job.
I think
is fired.
It's it goes along. I mean, you guys are gonna go along this journey, and I just want to say this real quick. I love that you guys are doing this, and I'm gonna try to come on various other ones, maybe not in the 40s, but various other ones throughout y'all's, race to the
you're
race.
Welcome back anytime, my friend.
Listen, I know that I definitely know this. I know I'll be coming on for some of the 70s, and definitely as we get closer and closer to more recent ones to yell and scream about. But I gotta tell you, the interesting thing about covering these is the movies that did win. Because we always talk about like the movies that we love or the movies that don't win. The movies that do win from these eras are fascinating in terms of like the history and of the justification that these people made in voting for some movies that I think are garbage and some that are actually like good but have no business beating other things. So it's just really interesting when you start comparing and contrasting things. But I can't wait for you guys going on this journey.
It's
at
gonna be
least
fun.
for the 40s right now.
I think
yeah.
so. Yeah.
I'm very much looking forward to it. You're, of course, welcome back anytime, my friend.